Good morning, everybody. Just wanted to give you a video on how to do section 4.6 because, of course, as you may or may not know or be able to tell, I'm not here today. Still have back issues and whatever. So, anyway, this is how we do section 6, which will start approximately on page 275-ish. Guessing on when it starts, I can't remember, but I know what's on the assignment, so, or what's there. Anyway, what would be expected of you, or what you're going to be introduced to this section, is going to be I. And I stands for imaginary numbers, and it's basically what it is for you guys is it's the square root of -1. Alright, so when we have the square root, usually we can't square root negatives until you take your I out, is what that's going to be. So we're going to be doing some square rooting stuff today again. You're going to be doing some solving. Very similar to what we did in section 5. A lot of the same things that we have there, it's going to show up in this section too. Before we go too much further into some of those things, though, I do want to explain to you one thing, and that is if I is equal to the square root of -1, what happens when I square the I? Okay, so what that means is now if I square one side, what you do to one side, you must do to the other. And the part of it that is different for you guys is this part right here. When you're square rooting and squaring at the same time, that cancels each other out. So realistically what's going to happen is whenever you see an I squared, it's going to equal -1 for you. Okay? So I squared is going to equal -1. Now that won't come into play on the first couple of examples, but it will towards the end. And I'll remind you what that means later on when we get to that step. Okay? But for now, just kind of put that on the back burner for a second, but we will use that towards the end of this video. Okay, so here it goes. The first section, or the first thing that it's going to say is it's going to say simplify. Simplify just means reduce it as much as you can. So if I have the square root of -8, okay, this is going to be treated just the same way that we did it in section 5. The only difference is I got this negative here. And what that means is, first of all, I need to take that I out, or take the -1 out. Okay, in order to do this, or to reduce the square root of 8, I need to reduce that, or take that I out. So what's going to happen is it's going to look like this. I, the square root of 8. And all the I is, again, is it's taking out the -1. Alright? So if you have a negative underneath the square root, you just take an I out, and then you continue on with the same thing that we had in the previous section. Where if I try to break down the square root of 8, 2 goes in there 4 times, 2 goes in there 2 times, and 2 goes in there once. I got a pair of deuces here, and then this 1, 2 stays underneath the house. So my final answer is going to be 2I, the square root of 2. Now notice where I put the I put it in front of the square root, but after the number. Some people I've noticed have put it behind the square root, so they put the I back here. The only problem with that is that a lot of people then tend to put the square root sign over top of the I, and then that would be wrong. So for that particular thing, anytime you have a square root of a negative, all you do is take your I out, and then you treat it the same way that we did the last assignment where we were trying to solve or try to reduce the square root. Okay? The next set of directions is going to look identical to what we had at the end of chapter, or at the end of section 5, and that's going to say solve. And it's going to have a problem that says 2x squared plus 11 equals -37. Now for this particular problem, what you're going to do, you're going to solve it the same way. Remember, we're undoing the order of operations, so you'd want to subtract 11 first. Okay, so that gives us 2x squared equals -48. Then what you'd want to do is you'd want to divide by 2. So again, what I'm doing is I'm getting rid of the order of operations in reverse order. So I get rid of any adding and subtracting first, then I get rid of multiplying and dividing second, and then the next thing that I would get rid of is exponents. How do you get rid of x squared or something squared? Good, you square root it. Nice job. That's a way to say that to yourself. This would give me x. And then over here, you've got the square root of a negative. So as soon as you see that negative, you're going to pull your I out. But also, don't forget, this should be plus or minus, which some of you have a hard time doing that still. But anytime you have to square root to get rid of something, you always have plus or minus. Again, I'm going to pull the I out, and then I'd have the square root of 24. Now the square root of 24 itself, though, I think can break down, but I'm going to just double check that. What times, or does 2 go into 24? Yes, it does. 12 times. 2 goes into 12 6 times. 2 goes into 6 3 times, and 3 goes in there once. I got one pair of 2's that get to go out. And again, this 2 and this 3 didn't have any friends, so therefore it's going to stay inside the house and multiply with each other, and I end up with a 2i, the square root of 6. So everything about that is the same as what we did last chapter. Everything about that is the same as what we did last chapter. Okay, so there's nothing new there. The only new piece is that you need to pull your I out. Then after that, they're going to give you some directions that will say simplify. And what they mean for you to do for that is nothing more than combining like terms. Okay, and you've been combining like terms for a long time. You guys have been doing this. You've been doing this not only in here, but in geometry, Algebra 1. Difference is I got an I, but really it doesn't do anything different. So I'm going to do 8 plus 5. 8 plus 5 is 13. And then negative 1i plus 4i is going to be 3i, and I'm done. There's nothing more for you to do beyond that point. Okay, if there was any other things that you could combine together, if they were different numbers or different, if they were both the same letter, then we could do it at that point. But in this particular problem, we are done. Now the only difference is that if I were to take and subtract them, it really doesn't do anything differently. We're just going to subtract like terms instead of adding them this time. So for here I've got 8 minus 5, which is 3, and then negative 1 minus 4i is negative 5i. The one thing I want to caution you on or be careful about is the fact that it does say a minus or it does say a plus in between there. So do not FOIL those. Okay? If there is a symbol in between them, make sure you're adding or subtracting and not multiplying. Okay? A lot of times people make that mistake where they multiply it rather than add it or subtract it. So be very careful with that. Make sure you identify if there's a sign in between there. Then after that, it's still the same directions. It's going to say simplify, but this time there's not going to be a symbol in between. So what am I asking you to do here is I'm asking you to distribute or use multiplication. So when I multiply here, what's 4i times negative 6? Okay, it's negative 24i. And then when I multiply for the back group, what's 4i times I? Well, here I end up with 4i squared. And this is the part that I wanted you to remember, because this right here, I squared. At the beginning, remember I told you that I was equal to the square root of negative 1. And what did I tell you that I squared was equal to? Negative 1. Right. So what I'm going to do is anytime I have an I squared, I'm going to replace it with negative 1. So the problem is going to look like this. Negative 24i plus 4 times negative 1. What's 4 times negative 1? It's negative 4i, or negative 4 I mean. So at this point I am done. There's nothing I can combine. But most people when they write this, they don't write it this way. They usually write it as the real part, so negative 4, and minus or plus the I piece at the back. So either way, the commutative property takes over. I'm not going to be too picky about it. I just want you to make sure that you have negative 4, and I'm going to make sure that you have a negative 24 in front of your I. But that is what's going to happen. Anytime you see I squared, we're going to replace that with negative 1. and then simplify it from there. So let me give you another one that deals more with FOIL. So I've got 3 minus 2i multiplied by 4 plus 5i. So here again, I'm going to FOIL, just like we had before. You guys have done this, I don't know how many times this year and previous years. But 3 times 4 is 12. And when you go to here, 3 times 5i would be 15i. Negative 2i times 4 would be negative 8i. And then negative 2i times 5i is negative 10i squared. So here again, I have a situation dealing with this term because I have I squared in play. And don't forget, we need to combine like terms between those two. So if I go to rewrite some things here, 12, what's 15 minus 8? Good, it's 7. So I end up with 7i. And then over here, remember what I squared was? I squared, remember, was equal to negative 1. So what I'm doing is, I took that I squared, I replaced it with negative 1. So I'm substituting there a negative 1 in for I squared. That multiplies those two together, and two negatives make it a positive. Good job. So I end up with positive 10. Then, from here, 12 plus 10 is 22, and the 7i follows up. You cannot combine those to make 29i. That does not work that way. You're not adding an I with a non-I together, a real piece with an imaginary piece. They don't really work that way. So you just have to leave that alone like that. So that's a FOIL problem. Let me give you another one just to make sure that everybody's okay with it. Let's go 7 plus 3i. 9 minus, let's just go minus I, just because. So when I FOIL this out, remember first outer inner last, 9 times 7 is 63. 7 times negative I is negative 7i. 3i times 9 is positive 27i. And then 3i times negative I would be negative 3i squared. Now again, we're going to combine our I pieces here. And I squared, remember, equals negative 1. So this is really going to get turned into negative 3 times negative 1. And a negative times a negative is a positive. Now the two problems that I've had to turn that into a positive, but what if the 3 would have been a positive to begin with? Then you would have had a positive with a negative, and then you would have had a negative there. So now, when I go to combining like terms, again, I'm going to combine the ones that are same. 63 plus 3 is 66. And negative 7i plus 27i is 20i. And I'm done. Notice, you'll never have anything left over that has higher than I, because the I squared will equal a negative 1 and so on. And I'll show you some other ones when I get back, hopefully tomorrow. So far that's FOIL. Now the only other thing that is going to show up for you guys on here is going to be the problems that look, and again, you had these already. We did one like this on your test last week. We also did one right before your test. But when you have I in the denominator of your fraction, that can't happen. Just like you cannot have the square root of something in the bottom. Because after all, I is the square root of negative 1. So that's why you cannot have that down there. So remember, when I'm multiplying here, I'm going to multiply by its conjugate. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm going to multiply by its conjugate, and the conjugate of this one ends up being 5 plus I. Remember, all you do is change the middle sign. And what you do to the bottom, remember, you must do on top. And now what this just became is two FOIL problems that we have to work together on in order to simplify this. So if I start with the top, 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times I is 3i. 2i times 5 is 10i. And 2i times I is 2i squared. Okay? Now remember, I squared is not going to stay as I squared. I squared is equal to a negative 1. So really that back looks like this. 2 times negative 1. And 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. So I end up with 15 minus 2 is 13. And then here, 3i plus 10i is also 13i. Huh. Ends up being the same number. Normally they don't. Then when I go to do the bottom, 5 times 5 is 25. Now I'm going to show you the whole FOIL, but remember what happens to the O and the I part of FOIL here. 5 times I is 5i. Negative I times 5 is negative 5i. And negative I times positive I is negative I squared. But again, I squared, this ends up looking like this, negative 1. And two negatives make it a positive. So I end up with 25 plus 1 is 26. 5i minus 5i, they cancel each other out. And I end up with 13 plus 13i over 26. When you have that simplified, if you can reduce that, you must. What number goes into both 13, 13, and 26 is 13. So what's 13 divided by 13? 1. Good. What's 13i divided by 13? 1i, or just I would be okay. And then 26 divided by 13 is 2. Good. So you can leave it like that. Some people also write it like this, 1/2 plus 1/2 I. Those would be identical. Not necessary to split it out into 2 like that. For me, you can leave it as 1. So that's just fine the way it's written. But all that stuff is the same as what we've done before. None of that is any different. The only thing that's really remotely different is the fact that I have an I in place rather than just not having an I. Okay? So hopefully that helped. Again, work together, use each other, help each other out. But it's on page 279 to 280. You're going to go 4 to 56. Multiples of 4, but you are going to skip 36 and 40. Alright, so I hope that helped. Hopefully that you can use each other and help each other out. And I hope to be back Tuesday. Hopefully I can walk tomorrow. So anyway, I will talk to you guys later. See ya. Bye.